Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Continue with the food in the back until it's all gone. But we're delighted to see everyone. I'm Dick Samuels, and I direct the Center for International Studies here at MIT, and I'm a professor in the political science department. It's a very special pleasure to introduce to you James Fallows, who's been a friend for more than a quarter of a century, I hate to admit. But as you surely know, Jim is a national correspondent for The Atlantic, where he's written for that magazine since the late 1970s. After graduating from Harvard, this is a return to Cambridge for him. He was the editor of The Crimson, and he worked for President Jimmy Carter's as Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter after he left Harvard. And he's reported, as you also know, extensively from outside the United States for many years, Malaysia, Japan, China, other places that I haven't been able to keep track of. And he's managed to write at least 10 books across a very wide swath of topics, from critiques of the media, where he made no friends among his colleagues, hopefully alienated a few, deservedly, analyses of Japanese society and economy, where we first came together, books on air travel, national defense, which was his first book, won the National Book Award for nonfiction. And his latest book, China Airborne, is available in the back, and I hope that you will all avail yourself of the opportunity to buy one and have it signed by the author. Today he's going to speak to us from his very well-informed perspective, as you can see, as an American in China, and we're delighted to welcome him. Jim?
Thank you very much, Dick, for that gracious introduction. Thanks for having me up here. You all know the many benefits of being in the MIT community, and among them that I hope you appreciate is the Asia program, and Dick Samuels and his colleagues. As a journalist, we have an uneasy relationship with academics, those of us in the press. We know we're not quite legitimate when we're around universities. It's fleeing universities. That's part of the reason that we ended up doing what we do for our line of work, but it's been a big plus to be able to draw on occasionally the expertise of people who have spent their professional lives understanding parts of the world. And so Dick has been very generous to me. I see a number of other friends here who I've relied on over the years, so thank you very much for having me here. I also want to introduce my wife, Deb, who's here in the purple scarf. It's a return home for her, too. We met when we were undergraduates, both at Harvard, but she was then in linguistics at Harvard. And MIT has had luster in the linguistics field even from those days, and so she spent some time here. We're both glad to be here. The Atlantic, where I've worked since the late 1970s, was since the late 1850s based in Boston. So for a long time I had reason to come here. Sadly, it is now based in Washington, D.C. It was based for many years in these historic buildings in Boston. Its headquarters is the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. Somebody will write a thesis sometime on all the ramifications of that change, but it won't be me. I'll just say that I'm glad to be here and glad to have an excuse to come back. There are a number of approaches I considered taking in talking for these next few minutes before we have discussions. I have both the privilege and the challenge of having an extremely well-informed audience in front of me. The privilege is it should be a rich exchange, and I'll hope to learn as much from you as vice versa. The challenge is on almost anything I say, it's likely somebody here knows better than what I'm going to say. So I'm going to assert some things in hopes that if I have to improve my state of knowledge, you will help me do that. And what I thought I would do is to talk with you about what it's like to try to explain conditions in a place like China or Asia in general, where I've spent much of my professional life this last quarter century, the ways in which somebody in my line of work tries to find out things and explain them to an American international readership. What things I think are interesting to explain now, and what the upshot is for how these things are absorbed in American public discussion and international policy in the non-academic part of how a nation observes the rest of the world, how it makes decisions pro or con. It would be useful for me, however, to have an initial poll of the crowd here. First, how many people are actually Chinese? And being a citizen or born there, that is useful to know. How many people have spent, let's say, more than 6 months in China, wherever you're from? How many people can speak Chinese? My hand goes down, Deb's goes up. How many of you are from other Asian countries, non-Chinese Asian countries? Now here is an informational poll I've been conducting with various people, different parts of America. How many of you are, the choices here are going to be basically fearful or basically optimistic? How many of you are basically fearful of the ramifications of China's increasing rise in the world? How many of you are basically optimistic about the ramifications? That's interesting. It's about 1 to 2 on the optimistic scale. If this were in Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, it might be a different result, but nonetheless. So here's the way you can think schematically about what I'm going to do in the next few minutes. First, I'm going to talk about a little bit of, I hesitate to use the word journalistic craft, because craft often fits ill with the undertakings of journalism. But that's what I'm going to do, is saying what it is like for somebody in my line of work to try to get his hands around a subject as vast and as unknowable about China, and why it is that I ended up writing the kind of 2 books I've written about China, why Deb has written the kind of book she recently did about China, how this fits into the general exercise of trying to explain something so inexplicable, so ungraspable, so constantly changing. That's going to be part 1, how we write and think about China and explain it. Part 2 is going to be what we write and think about China. I'm going to give you my best approximation as of, December 5th, 2012, of how the quicksilver developments in China seem to me most interesting, the ones that are in tension with each other, the ones we have some feeling about, the ones that are most profoundly difficult to get hold of. And then finally, in part 3, what the upshot of that is for a country like the United States, as it tries to make sense of this phenomenon that through the lifetime of most people in this world, the big economic phenomenon in the world, in this room, has been the growth of China. How, as individuals, as institutions, as corporations, and as a polity, we in the West think about the rise of China. I'll try to do this in maybe 30, 35 more minutes from right now. That should leave time for questions, and I'll be happy to go into. I will leave out more things than I cover. So anything that I left out, my preemptive explanation is I'm leaving it out on purpose so that you can ask about it later on. I'm putting in the things which I will build to the conclusion I'm trying to develop. First, journalistically, I think that here are a couple of contradictory sounding observations that I think are all true when it comes to journalism about China right now. The meta point, of course, is that contradictory things are true about China in every possible way, and getting some peace of mind about that chaos and unknowability is one of the sort of mental steps. I'll say more about that in a moment. But there are benefits and there are challenges to being in the business of explaining modern China to an international or especially a U.S. audience. I say interchangeably internationally and U.S. because my magazine's readers are mainly American. Our website is more American than anything else. But any English language medium in these days knows that it has an international readership. That has good and bad implications. I realized that when I was living in China, there were certain kinds of inside language and wordplay in English that I could or could not prudently use, because many people in China understand English well enough not to get the point of native speakers, discourse, or of high-end publications, something like the New Yorker or the Atlantic. And so there is that peril, but it is an audience in the U.S. and an audience internationally. One of the benefits of this age of coverage of China is that the place is so open and it has so much of a gold rush type aspect in the information field. Remember that when my wife and I first got to Shanghai a little more than 6 years ago, beginning what was a 3+ year stint of living there nonstop, and then went back a number of times. For the first day or two, I thought, I am never going to know enough about this place to say anything whatsoever about it. And then it was giving in to the chaos, the richness, the fact that every time you got on a bus, every time you got on a train, every time you got on any kind of conveyance, if you survived, you'd find something really interesting that you hadn't expected when you got out on the other end. And just recognizing that having some sense of this chaos and grandeur is a plus. The people who have problems in this environment are the narrow tribe of U.S. journalists who have the good and bad fate of working either for the New York Times or for CNN. And the reason is the Chinese government views them as agents of the U.S. government. And everything they do is seen through that filter. They also have, especially the New York Times, the obligation that whenever there's a political problem of any kind in China, the next person who's locked up, the next violation of due process or whatever, the Times feels some newspaper of record obligation to record that. So you can say that if there ends up being a sort of systematic, well-intended distortion in the main excellent journals of record from the English language world, they have to record so much of the political offenses that if 5% of the reality of China ends up being 30% of what's in the news coverage, this is something which is they recognize as being a challenge in what they do, but it is the obligation they have. I often think this would be as if foreign journalists based in the U.S. felt obliged to give a third of their coverage to Guantanamo or death penalty cases or whatever, things that are genuine problems in the U.S. but are not 30% of our news. So too with political problems inside China. For the rest of the people who don't work for CNN or for the BBC or for the New York Times, there is a kind of golden age sense of just so many things that you can learn about. And the way that Deb and I tried to explore this was just having a bias towards going and doing and seeing. We got to virtually every province of China except for Inner Mongolia and except for Tibet, which we were never allowed to go to. It was always a special, sensitive period whenever we went there. And the way that we ended up writing about things that were going on there, I think illustrated a two-tier approach in much of contemporary coverage about China, the richness of which and abundance of which I think is making it easier for the world to understand China, even at a time when it's changing so quickly and it can seem so hard to understand. One part of this approach would be what I think of as the overview, top-down, big picture essay, where you say, here is how to think about the environment in China. Here is how to think about the gender balance situation. Here is how to think about structural imbalances of the economy. Many people here in this room have written those kind of studies. I've written a number of them, especially my previous book, Postcards from Tomorrow Square, had a number of those essays. And I think that's a very important part of trying to say, where do we set the ground rules and understanding how some inexplicable seeming parts of modern China can actually be the case. On the other hand, something that seems to me a real glory of this period in international coverage about China is the proliferation of what you could think of as the universal in the particular, of studies of a town, an industry, a basketball team, an entrepreneur, a disaster, a success, and all the ways in which the larger Chinese saga can be extracted from what you see in these particular parts of the grand national tapestry. Deb's recent book, which I am biased but I loved, it's called Dreaming in Chinese, is what you learn about China by learning the Chinese language. She's a linguistics person, has learned a lot of languages. Everyone always says of her, as they never say of me, oh, you sound so good in our language. So her book was by learning Chinese language and dealing mainly with Chinese women, what you learn about this stage of development. Some other books in this category that I've found interesting. How many people here know the book Foreign Babes in Beijing? This is by Rachel DeWaskin. It's about a young American woman who becomes a soap opera vamp star in Chinese TV, epitomizing the sort of Kim Kardashian / Dallas vamp heroine and what she learned about China by being a foreign soap opera star there. My current book, China Airborne, was what I learned about China's aspirations and tensions and whether it's going to make the next step by seeing all the people who imagine themselves as China's Orville and Wilbur Wright, and China's Charles Lindbergh, and China's Neil Armstrong, and China's Amelia Earhart. And there are people who fit all these categories. And to me, it seemed that every tension and every prospect and every contradiction that you wanted to find about China has its analog in this drama of whether or not China is going to be able to take the next step towards becoming a more modern industrial technological power in the way that it would like to be. I won't give you all the stories I would love to tell. I'll give you just one story from this. And I'll encourage you to read some more by the wise words of Tyler Cohen, who you may know from the Marginal Revolution blog, who declared today this was the best nonfiction book of the year and the best book about China that he can remember. So learn from Tyler Cohen. But I'll give you an illustration of the kind of story that got my attention. There was a man whose family name is Xu, X-U, who grew up in Shanghai. He's about my contemporary, so he had hard times during the Cultural Revolution. He made his way to New York as a penniless graduate student in, I think, 1981, soon after the rapprochement, or the beginning of the opening. He had so little money when he got to Kennedy Airport that the cab ride to his dormitory at, I think, Long Island University left him with no money, or like 75 cents. So he got a job that night. He got another job the next day. He continued his graduate studies. 20 years later, he was a multi-millionaire. He decided he'd go back to China. And he went back to China with this mission. He'd one time been on a fishing boat in Long Island Sound during his time after he had some money, where people were on the boat, they were casting out their lines for bluefish or whatever. And on one of the back casts, a big grappling hook caught in the eyeball of one of the other people on the boat. There was screaming, there was bloodshed, there was panic. People wondered what was going to happen. And Mr. Xu said, the captain of the boat said, "Don't worry, I've called the Coast Guard. They'll be here in 8 minutes. Things will be fine." 7 minutes and 45 seconds, the Coast Guard helicopter is there. The rope comes down. The guy is lifted up. Mr. Xu learns that not only is his eye saved, but he lives. Everything is fine. He thinks, in my country, this man would have died. When I go back to China, I will bring helicopters to my country. So now he is back there. He's a coal baron, has lots of other things, but he's bringing helicopters to China so that the rescue after the Sichuan earthquake, there will be ways to save people. And the whole panoply of people with these half realistic, half crazy, half doomed, half sometimes dishonest ambitions to make the country all over at once is part of the story that I wanted to tell. There's also a surprising element of U.S.-Chinese relations that I thought I could illustrate better through this tale than most others that I knew about, which is who here flew on a Chinese airline, say, in the late 1980s or before? You recall those were not very attractive airlines and they weren't very safe. There was a very terrible safety record for Chinese airlines in those times. In the last 10 years, Chinese airlines have been statistically safer than U.S. airlines because there's only been one fatal crash in the last decade in China and more than one in the United States. Much of the credit for that belongs to an underpublicized and basically unknown team of officials from Boeing and the FAA and the NTSB and other organizations in the United States who decided over the last 15 years or so they would essentially become Chinese. They would spend their time within the bureaucracy saying, here's how you train check pilots. Here's why you can't have a son give the check ride for his father, the chief pilot, and you have to have some other checks and balances. Here's what governance means. And there's been this web of connections between the U.S. and China on the operating level. I ended up thinking after our time in China that human interactions mattered more in this relationship than almost any other I'd ever been part of. And so that's part of the story I tell, too. So to wrap up this longish first part of what I have to say, it is a time of, I think, almost every foreign writer and broadcaster and explorer who's in China now feels a sense of just wonder at the opportunities there to chronicle what's good and bad and promising and cruel and heartbreaking and inspiring that's going on there. And it's worth those of us in the reading public and the viewing public taking advantage of that diversity. So now let's go to the second theme of what I'd like to discuss, which is I've talked about how we try to describe the variety and chaos going on in China. Now, what would I describe that's going on there? And my answer to that question would change almost any day I was discussing this topic with anyone. I first went to China in the mid-1980s when we were living in Japan, but I hadn't spent concentrated time there until 6 years ago. And what I've learned is to pay attention to the provisional nature of anything that you see. You see what's in front of you. You don't know what's around you. You don't know what's going to be different in a month. I was, and this is, again, one more segue before giving you the content. 2 weeks ago, I was in southern China in Shenzhen, the great manufacturing city. I had a chance to go into the Foxconn factory, which was fascinating. I described that in the current issue of The Atlantic and just how it was different from what I expected. But the person I've been seeing in Shenzhen over the years and years is a man named Liam Casey, who's probably one of the main outsourcing connectors between China and the Western world. I think he's taught courses here from time to time. And the thing he has taught me is to recognize how much you don't know and how much less you know as time goes on. And having in proportion the little part of the mosaic you're able to see, and then trying to imagine both how that might be extrapolated and then the other things that might be the case. With that caveat, that this is the partial view as of December 5th, 2012, for discussion today and perhaps reconsideration tomorrow, what strikes me as fascinating about China for both outside and inside consideration is the conjunction of and contradictions among three simultaneous revolutions and transitions that are going on there. Now, the details of what I'm going to tell you, you all heard about a million times. I'm going to try to put them together in a somewhat different way. One of these transitions and revolutions, and the one that probably is given the least serious attention in the United States, is the economic change China is trying to go through now. The reason this is not really paid attention to by lots of people in the U.S. is many people assume that the Chinese economic problem is solved. Basically, they've won, everybody else has lost, that's it. A poll in Australia recently said that something like 80% of Australians thought that China already had the biggest economy in the world. You know that is not correct, but I think probably a near majority of Americans would also think that. There's lots of other things that Americans think that aren't true, but this is the one I am focusing on for the moment. You probably have heard the phrase that Susan Shirk, a friend of mine from UCSD, has used about her book, China, the Fragile Superpower. She says that when she's in America, people say, what do you mean fragile? In China, they say, what do you mean superpower? And I think that is the case when it comes to the economy, because from the outside, it's clear of how sweeping the momentum has been. And everybody who's been to Shanghai or to Beijing or on the high-speed train thinks, holy God, this is just the end of the world. That everything is possible in China, everything is new. I think people in China who've seen the West, who've seen the hundreds of millions of peasants who are still peasants, who've seen buildings that fall apart after a month or a year after they're built, recognize the contingent nature of this success. Contingent both in that it doesn't extend the entire country and that it may not answer the next problem China has. It seems to me the way to look at the economic achievement is for 30 years, China has solved a problem in heroic style. Over 30 years, hundreds of millions of peasants have become Dickensian-style urban working people. And that may not sound romantic unless you see these Chinese farms, and those who have seen Chinese farms know why many Chinese people want to leave and have even a tough life in the big city. So that has been a huge success with all the infrastructure that's gone with it and all the rest. And the national pride that many people feel in that is of course, deserved. But I think that if we are having this kind of gathering in China right now, the question would be essentially, is that all there is? Is that all there is in a couple of ways? That one, just can it keep going on its own terms? Will some of the instabilities of the overbuilding of infrastructure, these ghost cities in the middle of nowhere, is that going to be a drag on the system? I'm not even talking about the environmental aspects of continuing this growth, which I think are the worst challenge for China, but let's assume them as one more of keeping things going. The inequalities of the system, that's part one of the question of whether things can keep going in the same way. I think part two of the question is whether China can do something different from what it's done the last 30 years. Here I give you my prop. My prop is an iPad, which I hold before me. This, like all iPads, was made in China by probably by the people at Foxconn with parts from other places. If this iPad cost $500, as you know, even though it was made in China, only about $50 or $60 stays in China. And so the problem for the Chinese manufacturers is how can they not assemble iPads but have their own Apple? Not have knockoffs of Google but their own Google. Not have parts for Boeing but their own Boeing, et cetera, et cetera. Dick Samuels was one of many to teach me early on in life that the profits in international trade go to the large brand name corporations, to the Boeings, the GEs, the Mitsubishis, the Siemens, of which China doesn't have any. It is subcontractors for these firms. Japan has a lot of these. Korea has a lot. Taiwan has some. But the Netherlands has a lot. China doesn't have them. And so one question of economic transformation is, will it be something more than just a bigger assembly house for other people's high-end products? So that's part of the economic transformation that's going on. And this is actually the drama in my book of using aerospace and pharmaceuticals and infotech as test cases for whether China can go from the Dickens success to the sort of modern, mature international corporation success. And what makes that so challenging for China, I think, is that it's not simply a matter of building more buildings, laying more track, training more engineers, and the other thing the Chinese system can do, but the traits of rich countries are in certain ways different from China's. All rich countries have free presses of one kind or another. They all have free universities. They all have sort of civil sectors in a way that China doesn't yet. And so is it possible for China to have the economic strength of a rich civil society country with its current system? So that's one of the transformations going on now. And again, I'll say that the pollution goes in here too. A second revolution that is driven by and accelerates these other two is the social one, which I have a new sense of vividness about after this latest trip over the last month or two. What I mean here is that it struck me early on that one of the most important things you could know about somebody in modern China is how old that person was. Now, in the United States, we have our generational differences. Everybody admires my parents' generation, the greatest generation. Everybody hates my generation, the baby boomers. Everybody has some kind of hope, but also dismay about your generation for the kids, kids today. It rings down through the ages. So these are generations, and they happen around the world. In China, because the history has been so vivid and tumultuous in distinct bands, people of different ages have really different life experiences. People in their 80s have suffered terribly. People who are now in their 50s or early 60s, they've been hardened in a way. Their counterparts in the Western world, I think, have not. Most of the people running these big ministries, they were, during the Cultural Revolution, they were out someplace doing manual labor, et cetera. The young people, they've grown up during this era of rising aspirations and single children. And I saw that really vividly in Foxconn in southern China this last time, where even 5 or 6 years ago, if you went into factories, the workers were mainly women and almost all country people. You could tell, you know what a rural person looks like in China. Their skin is different, their teeth are different, their clothing, they just carry themselves differently. The people in factories, even a couple of years ago, were country people. People in these southern China factories now, they were not country people. They were the kids of country people who'd stayed in the city. They had, their gelled hair, and they had their faux hawks, and they were dressed just like people in any other Chinese city, but you could tell these were city kids. And the whole phenomenon of running a factory with 230,000 workers when there's 230,000 mainly male city kids. It's a whole different thing when they are mainly female migrants coming for 2 or 3 years to save, to go back to their village in Sichuan or whatever else. And so you have this second revolution that interests me is people who their living experience is rapid sophistication and more choices of all kinds, and just suddenly the world is open to them, and that has different kinds of matches to the political system, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the economic system. Here's one other point that occurred to me when I was in this latest factory visit. It's a cliche that China has accelerated all of our conventional paths of timescales for development, modernizing within a generation rather than centuries. Here's the social comparison that struck me. If, say, 10 or 15 years ago, if you went to Chinese factories, you would see the equivalent of New England factories in the 1820s. When I was an impressionable student at Harvard years ago, we studied the mill girl phenomenon of the early 1800s in New England. Of these people came in from their farms and they were working in the mills, and what that was like. And that was the kind of thing you saw not that long ago in China. If you were there a couple of years ago, it seemed to me that you saw the 1890s in American industrial history. You saw Upton Sinclair, and you saw all these huge factories with all the violence that went with them and the abuses and the efforts to resist the abuses. And now it seems to me you're seeing either the 1920s or the 1950s of this kind of flapper era youth that don't really know if they want to put up with what their parents did. So you have a very rapid movement of a lot of people in the society. And then third, so I've said there's an economic transition of whether it's going to make it to the next level. You have a populace that is fully willing to make it in this more mature way. And then we have the political system, with the third transition, which is by far the most problematic. And I'm going to end up here, this point, with a contradiction. It seems to me that around the world, political systems are generally a problem. I think that America is in good shape in almost all ways except for its political structure, which was founded 225 years ago for entirely different circumstances. We can't really revise, and that is our worst problem, I believe. Australia is the only country I know of where the political system actually makes the country better. It's a political system that sort of brings out the best of the people. For example, mandatory voting. And they all actually do it, and it makes for a more moderate political structure. But I think when it comes, if you want to find the most intense contradiction now between the momentum in a country and the political system, it is China as it goes through this transformation. Because to me, the simplest way to put it is the economy needs to mature, and the people are ready to mature, and the political system isn't. And how the tension between those things works itself out is to me the most interesting and important marker for us all to follow over the next few years. I'll give you another analogy from Foxconn, which spills into my diagnosis of what the Chinese government should do from my amateur foreigner perspective, and then whether or not that might be possible. So I mentioned that I got to go into Foxconn. And the reason I got into Foxconn after not being able to for years and years is I was in Shenzhen watching the second presidential debate, and I heard their mention of why are all these iPads built in China. I said, I can see in my line of sight where they're built. Why don't I call them up and see if I can go ask about a tour for this news peg? And so I did that, and they said, to my amazement, they said yes, because there was a new management that realized that Foxconn was making itself look even worse by not letting anybody in. And if they let people in, they actually would look better, as they do. For Chinese factories, it's a good one. That kind of confidence, I think, is something the Chinese political system as a whole lacks. And whether it becomes confident in that way is a main test. I'll give you just 2 or 3 illustrations. Anybody else here living in Beijing during the Olympics? You recall that the foreign ministry set up some authorized protest zones before the Olympics to show the maturity of the Chinese system. And of course, the security ministry denied all requests to protest and arrested most of the people who applied. So you had this tension between confidence and lack of confidence. I talk in my book about the desire to have the pent-up demand for aviation in China because all these people want to go to their factories to have shipments that way. The barrier is the PLA, which controls all the airspace and doesn't want to give it up. And so it's a security versus a relaxation tension. The internet, it seems to me the simplest, the one easiest indicator of the relaxation or not of the Chinese system is the speed of the internet. It's not so much that it's censored, because you can find ways around that, but the censorship makes it slow. And it means that universities have this penalty that just makes them, gives them a handicap versus MIT or any place else. And so I think that the government, the country is ready for a more relaxed government, but the government is not ready to relax. And essentially, that is the tension going on now with all the other frictions we're now hearing. And so to wrap up this point, and I'm going to have just one other sort of conclusion, I don't generally go for contradictions in life because that seems to be a dead end, but I genuinely think there's a contradiction here. And if somebody can talk me out of it or tell me one or the other is more probable, I will welcome that clarification. Here's the contradiction. On the one hand, I think the Chinese political system has to change, or else China just can't keep going on the way it is. The people are ready for something more. The economy demands something more. So it has to change, and yet I think it can't change. There are so many entrenched interests. There's so many things people are insecure. And so the resolution of that is something I hope those of you who are either scholars or actual Chinese people can tell me what the resolution is going to be. Because I think it has to change and it can't change. One or the other will prevail, but that is why I am watching it. So finally, and now just for 3 or 4 minutes, I've said, my first point was, this is a time of great richness in trying to explain a place that is just so engaging. And I'll come back to that in my envoi. So I'm saying it's a great time for learning about things. What's interesting right at this moment is the need to solve simultaneously an economic equation, a social equation, and a political equation, which is the hardest of all. And they all need to work out for this next step of the transition to take place. What does this mean for those of us who aren't Chinese as we deal with China's ups and its downs and its threats and its opportunities and all the rest? I'll just say a word about national policy from the United States. So we can talk in more detail if you want. I submit that the part of national policy from the U.S. that's been most stable from our 39th president, who was Jimmy Carter, to our 44th president, who is Barack Obama, if I have those numbers correctly, has been relationships with China. That through that time, there's been a steady 3-strand aspect to our outlook on China. Number one, we've decided we'd rather work with China than against China. There's no point in a new Cold War. If we can avoid that, it would be better. Number two, we've decided that we don't view China's rise as a zero-sum situation. They can get rich without it hurting us. You'll see all these charts showing that China's economy will sometime overtake America's. Sure, it has 4 times as many people. And so I think America through this time has said it's better for China to prosper. And the third part of the relationship has been, nonetheless, we're going to disagree. We're going to disagree on Taiwan, disagree on all sorts of things. But we want basically China to prosper, and we're going to maintain the disagreements, and that is a sort of stable equilibrium we're going to keep on. I think there's no obvious reason why that needs to change on either side. I think it's to the advantage of both sides to keep it going as long as possible. One reason, in my view, the Chinese authorities were not that upset about Mitt Romney's promises, former governor of your fine state here, his promises to do all these things on day one about China is, number one, they thought he wasn't going to win, but number two, they knew he would never do that. That this is how everybody runs when they are the candidate. Bill Clinton ran against the butchers of Beijing, and in office they find ways to maintain the policy. So national policy I view as being more or less stable on both sides with some friction points we can talk about if we want. Businesses and institutions, I've talked with a lot of corporations about the pluses and minuses of how they deal in China, and I won't go into that now. I think MIT and other academic institutions, I'm in favor of every exchange that's possible. I'm in favor of. I think the more Chinese students who come here, the better. If they stay in the U.S. in the long run, that's good. If they go back home to China, that's good. I think it's good to have just as many of these exchanges as can be. But I've found myself giving most of my pitches to Americans to the actual individual level of people, where I've tried to make the argument to many Americans that they should take China seriously without being afraid of it. That both parts of those, in my mind, are worth bearing in mind. Taking it seriously in the sense of recognizing it's going to affect the world, it's worth paying attention to the language and the culture and the politics, but not because they're about to take us over. You know, they have their own problems, much worse than America's, and there are ways in which it's a challenge, but that dual imperative of being serious about China without fearing China, it comes unnaturally to us as Americans. Usually we pay attention to countries only when we're afraid of them, and I think there's not good reason to be afraid, but there is reason to try to take it seriously. Let me now close with just one paragraph or so from my book with this prelude. When Deb and I were having our time in China, and we've gone back and forth, we had a lot of downed and discouraging moments. We got really sick because of the pollution, which is horrible. There was a time we came out of a subway station near our apartment in Beijing after midnight. It was freezing cold. It could have been like MIT in January, except it was that cold but still dark polluted too. And we came out of the subway in front of a karaoke bar, and we saw this pool of frozen human vomit from somebody who'd come out of the karaoke bar with a team of rats eating the frozen vomit. So we thought, this may be a low point in our time in China. But we nonetheless, we thought at every single moment it was always more interesting than it was horrible. And if you have the attitude of more interesting than horrible, you can go quite a long way in embracing a country. I have that view of America, too. It's usually more interesting than horrible. And I'm going to read just a paragraph, and then I'll say a word and sign off here. This is from the beginning part of my book, where I'm describing a trip I took as a ferry pilot in China when I didn't know that the PLA was circling over and I was about to meet my doom, which I didn't. But I said, now worried about the territory we'd be seeing from above. The main surprise of living in China, as opposed to reading or hearing about it, is how much it is a loose assemblage of organizations and aspects and subcultures, an infinity of self-enclosed activities, rather than a country in any normal sense. The plainest fact about modern China for most people on the scene often seems the hardest to grasp from afar. That is simply how varied, diverse, contradictory, and quickly changing conditions within the country can be. Any large country is diverse and contradictory, but China's variations are on a scale demanding special care, special note. What's true in one province is false in the next. What was the exception last week is the rule today. A policy that is applied strictly in Beijing may be ignored or completely unknown in Kunming or Changsha. Millions of Chinese people are now very rich, and hundreds of millions are very poor. Their country is a success and a failure, an opportunity and a threat, an inspiring model to the world and a nightmarish cautionary example. It is tightly controlled and it is out of control. It is futuristic and it is backward. Its system is both robust and shaky. Its leaders are skillful and clumsy, supple and stubborn, visionary and foolishly short-sighted. And I go on at some length. My point is, those of you who are from China and have studied academically, I have faith you'll tell me what I've gotten wrong here. Those of you who know even less about China than I do, I hope you'll take my inspiration to become immersed in it. If we as Americans and Westerners can be comfortable about this new part of the world, recognize it as always being more interesting and human than horrible or discouraging, then I think both our mental and practical and economic space becomes larger. So that is my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you very much for having me here.
Good. So we have microphones on both sides of the podium here. And what we'll do is, what I'd like to do is ask those of you who have questions to come up and ask questions. That means questions, not declarations, but questions, so we can engage in a legitimate conversation. Please. And please, if you would, just identify yourself briefly. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Guggenheimer, and I've been working with a couple of Chinese women who are graduate students here at MIT. And before that, my experience was of meeting Chinese teams who are coming to compete, high schoolers who are coming to compete here in the Harvard-MIT math tournament, and also coming to Eureka Fest. So high schoolers were coming from China over here, and now I've met two Chinese women graduate students, and one of them in particular I've been working with, who's at the Sloan School, is so smart and understands so much, both about China. She really gets the kind of things that you're talking about. So, you know, we talk about life here and what will it be like when you get back? And, you know, how can you fit into this system? So your contradiction, right? It seems to me that it's not just where it is for you. It's actually very much deeper for the coming generations who are coming out and then going back. And they all think of MIT as being really a phenomenal place. So the more students...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if there's a question, that would be great.
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll just go right here.
All right. So my question is really about this generation of young people and when they grow up, and how you see this fitting into your view.
So I hope and assume we'll hear from some people who are in this category of young Chinese people who have experiences in both worlds. My observation is that from a self-interested Western point of view, the reason I am so glad to have more and more Chinese people with this international experience is I think it's good for China, but I think it's also really good for connections between China and the rest of the world of just having this exposure to the variety and the goods and bads. With this illustration, after the financial crisis 4 years ago, the Chinese financial system was able to work much more quickly with Western financial systems because these people were all from MIT and Cambridge and Berkeley, for better and worse. But they were Western trained, whereas the political leadership in China is generally not. Although Xi Jinping, that week he spent on the farm in Iowa, seems to loom large in his imagination. So I think it is good for China and the U.S. that that people like many of you are aware of these contradictions. And I think the prospects in China become better if there's a larger share of people, of young Chinese people, who have the confidence that China is ready for a less constricted system than it has now. Of course, people who've been to MIT are not typical Chinese. You know, there are people, peasants in Gansu, who are more numerous. But still, the more there are with this experience, I think the better for China in the long run. But I'll hear otherwise from actual experts. Yes.
My name is Trevor Frankel. I'm just wondering, you see a lot of stuff in the media here about ghost cities and buildings that crumble and just waste in a lot of the infrastructure spending. Is that something that you saw as widespread, or does that just get played up in the media here?
I have seen a lot. So we're talking about these ghost cities. So I describe in my book the phenomenal... Any category of construction you're looking for in China, there's more in China than any place else, including airports. I think there's maybe one airport being built in the U.S. now. There are 100 major airports being built in China now. And part of this is for expanding demand, for people who really need it. Part of it is just because it's building contracts and land contracts. And so I think that the default explanation for almost anything in China in the last 20 years has been some kind of public works project. Somebody who is getting a land deal or a paving contract or whatever. So this stuff is overbuilt beyond any rational utility for it. You can argue that in the long run, there'll be people to fill these cities and customers for the shopping malls. They don't seem to be there now, but it keeps people at work in the short term. So yes, I agree wholeheartedly with the overbuilding observation. Whether that leads to a bubble and crash, I don't know, because it's a whole different financial structure from here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing. I have two parts of the question. One is to echo the younger generation, because China has the one-child policy, which I think is a huge social problem. to the future of China, the contradiction you mentioned, and the conflict, and also the parents, because I teach Chinese and I also did one-child research and also do delegation training for Chinese visitors, government officials and business leaders. What kind of training do you think for the one-child generation that they need when they come here for training, instead of just tour around Ivy League college campus, but really, do some in-depth training for that generation, also for the parents, because parents mostly are the company, CEOs and high officials, and what kind of training they need when they come here besides leadership, innovations?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer that's as good as the question. I think it's a really, really important question. Let me give you a couple of things on the side, then get back to the heart of your question. The one-child policy is, of course, it has huge ramifications around China. My observation is that most people thought, on the one hand, there are problems. On the other hand, the problem of overpopulation would have been worse. That if China hadn't done this, the problems for the country would have been worse. So that would be one issue. The psychology of a nation of single children, yes, that is an issue too. And I think the particular thing you're asking about of expectations of U.S. education for elite Chinese people, that's very important. I said that I think it's really good to have these exchanges, and I do. But the expectations on the Chinese side, as you know, are often very different. I think the best part of American higher education is we have hundreds of great universities. In China, people have heard of Harvard, and they've heard of MIT, and maybe they've heard of Yale. And so there's this tension on just a couple of institutions for people to go there. And Chinese universities are very different in how the children study and what the expectations are. So I think I don't know what kind of counseling they should get, but I agree with you that it's a really important thing to do. And my wife behind you has actually worked in this field, and she may like to discuss this with you. But yes, I agree it's a very important thing.
How about for the parents?
Yes, for the parents too. And I think we have some friends in China who are Westerners whose job is essentially fixers, Chinese families with U.S. university admission. The ones who are good, they take seriously the business of explaining to the parents of what this is going to be like and how it's different from the Chinese situation. The ones who are bad are just collecting fees to try to get people into an Ivy League school. So I think that maybe as this phenomenon increases and the need for advice expands too, maybe more people will do it. So I agree, it's a real issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Peng Wang. I'm an MIT student from China. My question is, because of the contradiction you mentioned before between the country and the control of the Communist Party, do you think there is a real danger of kind of revolution that may destroy what China has built in the 3 decades?
My honest answer is, I don't think so, but I don't know. And here's the longer answer. At the Aspen Institute this summer, I got to moderate a really fascinating debate between Min Pei, who is he's from Shanghai originally at Claremont McKenna, who is a very skeptical of the ability of the Communist Party to survive. He says just these contradictions are 100 times more than I've said, and it just can't go on. And Eric X. Lee, who is this venture capitalist who basically says, Communist Party chooses the best leaders, this is the best system, stop complaining. And they were saying these completely opposite views of Min Pei saying it can't go on even 5 years, and Eric Lee saying it can go on for 100 years. Then I also heard about a month ago, I got to interview Stapleton Roy, former ambassador to China during the Clinton administration. He was born in Nanjing, his first language was Chinese, his parents were missionaries. And he said that because the system can't go on, he had faith that the Xi Jinping generation would actually change things because they recognized that the alternative was too bleak, that if you have actual conflict, actual regional tension, that just would undo everything that China has achieved. So I don't think there will be this kind of violence because I think everybody involved would say that would just be so horrible. But I don't really know. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us so many wonderful insights tonight. My name is Yin Gao, and I'm a graduate student at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT. My question is similar to the previous question, but based on your knowledge of other countries in the region, such as Japan and so forth, we have seen in the past that those countries also underwent significant change in that they used to have a rigid control of the economy by the government, and Taiwan and Korea comes to mind, but they have underwent great transition and they are democratic and functioning now. Do you see in China a fundamentally different story, or how do you judge?
That's like all of these, that's an excellent question, and I'll tell you how I've thought about that. We actually were in Korea during its time of transition. Our children were there, little boys, little blonde-haired boys, during all the riots in Seoul in 1988, and they would go out wearing gas masks. They were very excited to be in this sort of urban combat, and that was a time when there was a military government. It was state controlled of the chaebols, however it's pronounced, and so it was a very, very tightly controlled regime. And now Korea is both very rich and it has political problems, but it's a genuine democracy now. And that is Taiwan has all of its own political problems too, but it has liberalized and is very rich. And you would think that objectively and rationally, the people, new 7 members in the standing committee could say, look, if it's good enough for Korea, if it's good enough for Malaysia, if it's good enough for the Philippines, although they have their problems, it should be good enough for mighty China, that we have come to this point where we should give people at least more liberties. That structural democracy we can phase in, but more liberties for people, more rule of law. And then, on the other hand, you can have people say, as I do, oh, that sounds like Gorbachev. And look what happened to Gorbachev. His country is half as big as it was in land and in people. They're now ruled by the mafia. Do you want to be the people who let China fall apart? So rationally, I think that China deserves the things you're saying, but I don't know whether enough people in the standing committee think that. And I'd be curious also if some of our Chinese students will say what they think is going to happen too. But yes, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name's Michael. I went to a graduate school down the street.
Yeah.
More recently, there was a documentary, a young journalist, and he was taking his mother shopping, and the whole point of the documentary was for the mom to not buy something that was made in China. It was actually amazing, very difficult time buying any product in the U.S. This journalist interviewed a lot of intellectuals in China, faculty in the U.S., and it was interesting to hear some of the professors in China say that America, and this is what I'd like to have your point of view on, America's and the West in general is so interested to sell into China products, and at least when I was in China 5 years ago, a U.S. company could only, with a joint venture, own 49%. I don't know if that's still true.
That's changed.
Okay. But the professors in China, which I thought was very forthright and honest, is that Americans are giving away their intellectual property because the Chinese are building the General Motors and jet engines and whatnot. And he said for the short-term gain, the Chinese professor that I thought was pretty convincing, the short-term gain of selling into China for these Western companies is going to be a long-term consequence where the Chinese are going to be building their car with our technology and that airplane that they'll sell here. So what do you think about that?
Boy, if only there were a book that looked at this question exactly and tried to look at these engine factories and all the rest. China, like any other catch-up country, like the United States in the 1800s, we were stealing patents from England. It's amusing to read Charles Dickens's chronicles when he goes across the U.S. in the 1840s. Half of the stuff he says is his outrage at seeing pirated copies of his books, for a nickel in St. Louis or wherever else. So, like the U.S., like Japan, like everybody else, China is soaking up free info as much as it can. And this is number one, a genuine concern for companies. Western companies need to be very careful in how they do this. And number two, a genuine push in international treaties, that the U.S. needs to push for these things. And number three, it's something that China has to fix to take the next step itself. It's not going to have any of its own really good companies in the long run if they all get their stuff stolen too. So I think it's a genuine issue, but so yes, it's a genuine issue. Number two, I think the Chinese situation is quite different from, say, Japan's during the heyday of U.S.-Japan showdowns, in that Japan is full of great big corporations that are head-to-head competitors with the U.S. corporations, as China is not. China doesn't have Mitsubishi or Daimler or anything else of the sort. So yes, it's an issue. I think it's a decreasing but still real issue in dealing with China. Yes.
Hi. I'm Zen Chu, and I teach one of our healthcare ventures courses here at MIT. And so I've been pulled over to China and probably have been there 7 times in the last couple of years, really learning about the Chinese healthcare system. And I think from my perspective as an ABC, it's just naked, scary capitalism healthcare that exacerbates so many of the problems that we have in healthcare here.
Yeah.
And that some of the government's fundamental policies, they're trapped in that it is such a big economic challenge, given that most of it's 90% private pay today, and that they're having to layer in just basic services. Mm-hmm. But I'd be interested in kind of how you see that evolving.
Yes, and so for all of you who are Chinese know this. Those of you who, some of you, the rest of you may not. The good side of the opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping was all this collaboration with the West. One of the bad sides internally was entirely getting rid of the social safety net of the retirement programs and health care and whatever. So it's very much a cash upfront health care system, which has all the drawbacks we know about. Part of the reason there's such structural, huge over-savings by the Chinese economy is that people have to save for illness. They have to, and the one-child policy aggravates that because there's so few young people. For old people, they have to save for health care, they have to save for mortgages and all the rest. So there is this bias towards saving. I think there is, even in the last 6 or 7 years that we've been seeing things in China, I will say to the communist government's credit, they have fairly sensitive antenna for sources of popular discontent. Whenever something is bubbling up, there'll be some solution to that. And so whether it's problems of migrant workers, they've been addressed somewhat, and there's some increase in the healthcare system, but that was the real negative of the reforms in '79. There's no social safety net, hardly at all, and so it is a much more naked capitalist system than here. Yeah.
Sir, thank you for coming. Jordan Foley, grad student at MIT, and I had a question dealing with my generation in China and nationalism. And the reason I asked this question is because this past summer, or I've been to China a few times, but this past summer I was part of a junior officer exchange with the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy. So 5 of us went over and to the Dalian Naval Academy for a month, and every time something happened, it seemed like they were putting their best foot forward every time, and everything was extravagant and great. And one example was we had a basketball competition, and they played 5 ragtag Americans which was literally a CBA team. I don't know where they got these guys, but they were phenomenal, and they beat us pretty bad. But as we got to know them, I noticed everything was driven by nationalism and patriotism. And my question is, have you seen this in my generation more so than other generations, or is this something that's brand new?
So I will say yes, but. And bear in mind you're dealing with military people there, which is a different, any place has a different sort of nationalistic, patriotic slant. Number one, I am a big fan of the efforts the U.S. military, mainly the U.S. Navy, has made over the last generation to be involved with the PLA. I think the PLA, the greatest danger to China and to the U.S. is the isolation of the PLA. So I think it's great, even if you got beaten up in the game. I'm glad you were doing it. Point 2 is yes, of course, and point 2 is about the grandiosity. Of course, they'd want to beat a bunch of American basketball players, the world's biggest military, the world's best basketballers, and they can beat them. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? So that kind of nationalistic pride I can understand, again, even though you were on the receiving end of it. And you saw the version of that, too, in the contrast between the London and Beijing Olympic opening ceremonies. The Beijing opening ceremony was essentially bow down in fear at our magnificence of we can do everything in coordination. And the London one was what a weird place England is, because England had Olympics before. England sort of knew its place in the world, and the Chinese were asserting their place in the world. But here's my main point about nationalism. I found China generally a less nationalistic place than either the United States or Japan in this way. Most of the time, you're dealing with people as a Shanghainese with the hatred towards people from Beijing, or somebody from this company with hatred of their rival, or somebody from the Chongqing clan who was trying to get money from somebody in some other clan. So it was a very fragmented and locally conscious society, except when there was some perceived slight to Chinese national dignity. You know, that I think that if there's an offense to Chinese national success, national dignity, then you have a sense of, well, what do you mean? You know, 100 years of humiliation, you're not going to push us around. But that seemed to me a second-tier thing. I'll give you an illustration from Foreign Babes in Beijing. Rachel DeWaskin talks about how most of her time there was, you know, the only lines of affiliation were the stars of one show versus the stars of another show, and whose show was more popular and all that. But then the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy. Everybody in China knew it had to be on purpose. How could the U.S. make that kind of mistake? People, Americans know, oh, God, these kind of mistakes happen all the time. But she said suddenly everybody in China was furious at every American. And so I think that is an extreme case of this disrespect of national dignity. And Chinese people can tell me whether I'm right or wrong on that, but that's my observation. So it didn't seem to me like a profoundly nationalist place, but could become so when provoked. Yes.
Hello, I'm Chikaku Ueki. I'm a visiting scholar at Center for International Studies. Thank you very much. I found the talk extremely interesting. I have a question about sort of you mentioned about Japan a few times in your answers too, but I like you to sort of do a parallel on what you think. In May of 1989, you wrote the article Contain Japan, and I think there were two underlying sort of a message that you were putting out. One is that some things has to be said, and that some of the important things were not being discussed, which needs to. And I think you talked about allies and alliance and sort of diplomacy. But the second thing I think had although degrees are very different, but had some similarities to what you said today, which was that the Japanese people were not really standing up for their own interests, as it were. So it was more the problems on the sort of the civil side, political side of that society, which was not getting to the next step, as it were. I'm curious to think, looking back then and then 20 years, 30 years now, whether you any takeaways from that case to what you said about China. And another thing is that I'm very much interested because when you wrote that article, I think you were sort of ahead of the curve in making this argument. Now, today you talked about not being afraid about China. And I think we do see in this country and in other countries too that people are sort of somewhat afraid of China. Why is that, do you think? Is there some kind of a sort of use of foreign menace in the political discourse? Is that what's happening, or is it just something different?
So the many, many rich threads here. I'll choose two or three. One is, I feel very lucky to have worked for The Atlantic for a long time. The Atlantic has a good readership in the U.S. If only I were as well known in my home country as I am known in a hostile way in both the Philippines and Japan. For two articles I wrote about each country in the 1980s. One was I wrote an article in the Philippines called A Damaged Culture in 1987. Every other day in the Philippines, 25 years later, there's some denunciation of that article, which is interesting. And many people in Japan noted an article I wrote called Containing Japan in 1989. I believe that the two most different countries I know are China and Japan. Now, I know that's an exaggeration, that Botswana is different from Finland, but within a sort of similar set, I think China and Japan are profoundly different in their economic structure and their interactions with the world, et cetera. And I think my economic argument, economically, I think they're different. With Japan, it really was Toyota and GM, and Toshiba and IBM. And again, that doesn't come up on the Chinese case. The political system, I think it's not so much that the Japanese system has this clutch on Japanese society the way the Chinese system does. It's a more sort of a dysfunction, as you're well familiar there. So I think that So I think many things you apply to Japan apply differently in China. I'll skip to this last foreign fear point. I did a long article in The Atlantic about a year ago about the sense of American decline and how that had changed over the years. And the truth of American society is that from almost the first days of colonization, people in America have been afraid that their best days were behind them. In 1630, they were afraid that 1620 was the best, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been the way all the way along. The difference starting after World War II is having foreign standards of comparison, falling behind the Soviet Union, falling behind the Japanese, falling behind the Chinese. So I think there is this place in the American mind which says, our schools are bad, therefore China must be number one. And China has nothing to do with our schools, but I think there is that natural projection. I actually am impressed how little of that there is about China now, considering if all the things that are wrong with the U.S., there's not as much sort of fear of China as there could be. So that's we can talk about this more tomorrow, as we will discuss. Yes.
We have time for two more questions, so the two people at the microphone, and then we'll let you have a chance to meet your public. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Callie Denhire. I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And
my mom's alma mater, so good to see. Yeah.
And we've been talking quite a bit about America, and we've gotten a bit to the regional parts as well. And I was curious on your thoughts on what China's been up to in the South China Seas recently, especially with the new passports they issued and how they're kind of flexing their military muscle in that area, but at the same time that's very much connected to the politics and considering, you know, the ability to change, the need to change, but the ability not to for political, how that relates to their military in the South China Sea.
I see members of the audience I should call up to answer this question. I'm looking at you, William Fallon, but I'll do my best. This seems to me more worrisome than most things that go on between the U.S. and China. I'm generally in the calm down camp about the military menace between the U.S. and China because the scale differences are so enormous between the PLA and U.S. forces. And Taiwan, of course, is an ever-present instability. But the announcement, I guess a week ago, the Hainan authorities said they were reserving the right to board any ship that passed through their claimed territorial waters, which were essentially the whole of the South China Sea. And some people have said it was just fishing vessels, or maybe it was just people doing propaganda tours. I don't know. If that were meant as an actual new edict by the PLA Navy to stop commerce through the South China Sea, that would be a big problem. I don't think they can imagine that. I hope that this is just one of these either random or intended forays that will be met by calm resistance from the U.S. and others and saying, you can't possibly mean this. You can't possibly mean that China's going to bottle up the main shipping lanes in the world. So it is, in the last 2 years, there have been many signs of the military sort of seeing how far it can expand. I think it's worth having calm, even-tempered, saying, well, this far is far enough, and let's all get along by not destabilizing things. Yes?
Last question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is JJ, and I'm an undergraduate here studying math and econ. So it's clear from your talk that you believe that one of the key drivers for future sustainable economic growth in China is innovation and the establishment of local content. And what's your observation in like Chinese like R&D system and the university, the research? Because I received elementary and middle school education in China, and the work ethics and the discipline students exert was like phenomenal. And I can easily see like a lot of my peers could succeed in MIT better than I do. So what's the loophole there?
Yeah. So how many people here are graduates of a Chinese university? Some people here must have degrees from Chinese universities. You all know that Chinese universities are greatly increasing in investment and in numbers of people they're turning out. I argue in my book a very skeptical view of Chinese universities and saying that it's going to be very hard for them to become great unless, again, the political system changes. I think that for the last 30 years of education and everything else, the political system has been fine because it's been able just to have these mammoth expansions of everything and training the engineers for that and all the rest. But in the longer run, to have the sort of world-leading center that MIT is and that Stanford is and that Berkeley and that others, not just in the U.S., but in the Western world have been, essentially what you need to do is to have the most talented people in the world will choose to go there. Say that I want to have my working career here in Cambridge, Mass, or in Palo Alto, or in Cambridge, England. For them to decide to do that in Changsha, or in Beijing, or in Shanghai, lots of things have to be true. They have to be nicer places to live in terms of pollution. I think they have to be freer places in terms of using the internet. If your internet is half speed, that is a discouragement. In thinking you can get visas. I know visas are a problem in the US, but they're a different kind of problem in China now. And so I think that most of the expansion in Chinese university has been more apparent than real so far. I think Chinese students have been great. You know, the more of them who come here, the better. But I think that Chinese students in Chinese institutions, the Chinese institutions have been the limit. And so I think that a sign of China taking this next step and solving these contradictions will be better universities. If the universities are better, that will be a bellwether of sort of a better society overall. That will be more threatening to the Western competitors, but it'll be better because China as a whole will be a more sort of incorporated society in the rest of the world. So that's my argument, that the Chinese students, like you and your friends, are trained really well, and so bring them here and have them use their skills here. So thanks for all of you who have come here this evening. Thanks for those who come to America, and appreciate your having me. Yeah.
And you have a few minutes
yes,
to...
Sure.
Okay, so Jim has agreed to spend some time at the desk back there with his books, and he's happy to chat with you and sign some for you. Thank you all very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Starr Forum. Thank you.